Jaime Lannister stood in the Red Keep's throne room, the metallic taste of blood lingering on his tongue, the clamor of battle echoing still in his ears. The Mad King's corpse lay sprawled on the stones, a heavy golden cloak draped over Jaime's shoulders. It should have felt exhilarating, the moment he ended the reign of a tyrant who had threatened to burn King's Landing to the ground. But the rush was tempered by an unsettling hollowness. As the torches flickered, illuminating the carnage of the sack of King's Landing, he felt less like a savior and more like a traitor to his vows. His eyes flicked to the Iron Throne where the dead king had once sat, and he wondered if the city would ever know the truth of what transpired here. Truth often died quieter deaths than the men who told it. In the silence that followed, he half expected someone to come forward and praise him. He'd slain the monarch who had menaced his own subjects with wildfire. Instead, the hush was broken by the entrance of Eddard Stark, sword glinting as he stepped carefully around fallen knights and the wreckage of battle. Stark's gray eyes landed on Jaime, taking in the scene. The king's corpse, the blood on Jaime's sword, the arrogance in Jaime's posture that he could not quite hide. Jaime braced for condemnation but gave no explanation. The slight upturn of his lips belied his sense of triumph. Let them think what they will, he thought. At least King Aerys would not be torching anyone else. Yet condemnation came swift as winter winds. Word spread that Jaime Lannister had broken his Kingsguard vows, that he had taken the life he was meant to protect. One rumor claimed he had done it to win favor with his father, Tywin Lannister, who had taken the city. Another told of a sense of twisted justice, that Jaime had wanted the Mad King dead after the monarch had forced Jaime to watch unspeakable cruelties. Still others believed he was simply an opportunist. No one asked Jaime what had really happened, why he slew the king. Fewer still had interest in that truth, for there was a new king to be crowned and a fresh order to be established. Justice would be swift for a kingslayer, or so men whispered. The great council that convened after Robert Baratheon took the throne was rife with tension. Lords from every corner of the realm crowded into the hall. Robert's massive presence dominated the dais, the Baratheon stag upon his surcoat prominent for all to see. To Robert's left stood Eddard Stark, silent and resolute. To his right lingered Jon Arryn, the new hand of the king, who was as calm and measured as Robert was boisterous. Tywin Lannister loomed near, arms folded, his face carved from stone. Jaime stood in the center, unarmored and unarmed. A hush fell over the court that was as thick as molasses. Jaime kept his gaze lifted, determined to meet every eye. He had expected, or perhaps hoped, for a quick pronouncement of gratitude, a grudging acknowledgement that he had ended a tyrant who would have reduced them all to ash. Instead, Robert's voice roared across the hall. Jaime Lannister, you broke an oath that all knights revere. You pledged yourself to protect the king, and yet you slew him. Aerys was mad, we all know it, but the realm cannot abide oathbreakers. By the gods, we should have your head. The phrase was followed by a chorus of murmurs, some in approval, some uncertain. Jaime's heart pounded. Even so, he wore a bright smile, as though the entire affair was a performance meant for his amusement. He did not grovel or attempt to prove his innocence, nor did he spit out all the vile truths that might have garnered sympathy. What did it matter now? He half expected his father to rise in his defense, but Tywin remained silent, eyes cold. Jaime realized then how alone he was, standing before the new king of the Seven Kingdoms. Minutes stretched on, and finally Jon Arryn spoke, voice carefully modulated. Your Grace, might we consider an alternate course? The realm has endured too much bloodshed of late. Removing the heads of noblemen, especially those bound to powerful houses, could lead to further unrest. Lord Tywin has shown every indication of loyalty now that the Targaryens are unseated. Executing his son might complicate the matter. Robert grunted, scowling. His weight shifted on the throne, and he tapped the pommel of his warhammer against the dais in a restless manner. You speak of politics, but I speak of justice, he growled. Then he surveyed Jaime with a look that blended anger and frustration. I've no mind to stain my reign's first days with a cold-blooded execution. That does not mean he will go unpunished. The man took a vow. Let him take another. The Black brothers stand in perpetual need of knights. Do they not? He can spend the rest of his days at the wall. Shock reverberated through the hall. Jaime looked to his father. The Lord of Casterly Rock gave no visible reaction. His lips pressed into a thin line. As humiliating as it might seem, exile to the Night's Watch might be preferable to death. But to Jaime it was an unthinkable fate. The Kingsguard was supposed to be the pinnacle of chivalry, the highest honor a knight could aspire to. The Night's Watch was a dumping ground for criminals and bastards. He fought the urge to spit in disgust, and he clenched his jaw. Robert's voice boomed again, sealing Jaime's fate. Let the realm know. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, will spend the remainder of his miserable life on the wall, protecting us from the terrors of the far north. He will never marry, never hold land, never father children. That is the punishment for oath-breaking. Tywin offered a single nod, as though he had already seen the outcome and accepted it. Jaime felt his stomach churn. There was no last-minute rescue, no cunning Lannister ploy to save him from this destiny. The sentence was final. Disgraced, disowned by silence, Jaime was marched out of the hall under guard, leaving behind the faint echoes of whispered slurs. Kingslayer, Oathbreaker, Night's Watch Dog. In the days that followed, the name Kingslayer began to cling to Jaime like a rancid perfume. He recalled the days after he'd been named to the Kingsguard, the sense of pride, the knowledge that he had been the youngest in generations to earn that white cloak. Now he felt that cloak had turned black in spirit even before he donned the black garb of the Watch. The official ceremony was a formality. He was stripped of his white cloak before the entire court. Some spat at his feet, others looked away, as if seeing him naked for the fraud he had become. His father did not deign to attend that humiliating affair. Cersei was nowhere to be seen either. He was given a single night to gather what few possessions were permitted. A horse, a sword, some clothes, and coin that would serve him no use at the wall. In that one night, Jaime found himself wandering aimlessly through King's Landing, the city he had fought to save. He gazed upon the smoldering remnants of the sack, the evidence of Lannister brutality under Tywin's command. There was no pride in him then. The small folk eyed him with fear or scorn, and the gold cloak he had once worn so proudly seemed a distant memory, a relic from another life. He left at daybreak, escorted by a handful of guards loyal to Eddard Stark, a token gesture to keep him from fleeing south. They wore the sigil of House Stark on their cloaks, the gray direwolf on a field of white, and they did not speak to him unless they had to. He did not bother introducing himself by name or rank. What good was a name now that it stood for betrayal? He had always been Jaime Lannister, favored son of Tywin, twin brother to the Queen, the Golden Knight. Now, he was but a grudging conscript bound for the bleak northern frontier. The journey north stretched interminably. He had never traveled with so little ceremony. In the past, every road he'd taken had been under the banner of House Lannister or the Kingsguard. Banners fluttering, lords doffing their caps, peasants bowing in subservience. He had known a life of constant validation. But now, farmers barely acknowledged the traveling party, or if they recognized Jaime's face, they spat in the dirt after he passed. The nights were cold, and the men huddled around meager campfires, talking softly among themselves about their homes and families. Jaime listened with an uncharacteristic sense of longing. He thought of Casterly Rock and wondered if he would ever see it again. Almost certainly not. Even if he did, he would no longer be its heir or its favored son. The punishment was meant to strip him of everything except his life. It had succeeded. As they approached Moat Cailin, the swamps and bogs of the Neck gave way to the vast northern expanse. The autumn air turned sharper, a taste of winter on the wind. With every mile, Jaime felt more distant from his old self. The weight of his sword at his hip reminded him that he was still a knight, at least in skill if not in honor. When the guards who escorted him occasionally tested him with jibes, calling him Oathbreaker to his face, he resisted the urge to retort with steel. It would do no good. His path was set. It was near dusk when they finally reached the King's Road's northern stretches, leading up toward Castle Black. The sky was a colorless gray, the setting sun an afterthought behind thick clouds. When the towering wall came into view, even Jaime, who had thought he'd grown numb to wonder, could not help but stare. The wall was colossal, a massive edifice of ice that stretched impossibly high, dividing the known world from the frozen wastes beyond. He had heard tales of it as a child, but the reality dwarfed every rumor. He felt small for the first time, dwarfed by this monumental structure that was now to be his home. The garrison at Castle Black was a stark contrast to the Red Keep. Where King's Landing bustled with life and color, the courtyard of Castle Black felt dim and sparse. Men walked about on daily tasks, dressed in black garb that had seen better days. Some were old, their backs stooped from years of toil, while others were raw recruits, looking lost and apprehensive. There were criminals and bastards, knights fallen from grace, and second sons with no inheritance. Jaime realized grimly that he was just one among them, a cast-off from a system that had no place else to put him. When the Stark guards finally delivered him to the Lord Commander Solar, they departed without ceremony. The Lord Commander at that time was Jeor Mormont, a bear of a man who had seen over 60 winters and still stood tall. He regarded Jaime with a cool scrutiny, showing neither fear nor disrespect. "You're the Kingslayer," Mormont said, straightforward and direct. Jaime lifted an eyebrow. "So they tell me," Mormont snorted. "We don't have much use for titles here, except the ones we earn by our labor. You'll find no gold-shod stable or plush bed, and your name won't grant you any shortcuts. You're here to protect the realm. If you refuse, you'll be hanged. Or you can run south and be declared a deserter, in which case you'll lose your head for certain. Does that rest easily on your shoulders?" Jaime squared his jaw. He had no illusions. He expected a cold reception, though part of him still flinched at how casually the Lord Commander threatened to execute him. This was the discipline of the Night's Watch, a brotherhood sworn to duty, where the proud were broken or they died. "I have no intention of running," Jaime said. "I made my choice. I'll bear the consequences." Mormont regarded him in silence for a moment, as though he could see straight through the practiced charm Jaime used to mask his unease. Then, with a curt nod, he signaled for one of the Black brothers to guide Jaime to his new quarters. "You'll start like any other new recruit. No special privileges. You fight, you muck stables, you stand guard. If you step out of line, you'll be punished accordingly. I hope you have a thick skin and a stronger backbone." Jaime gave a tight smile. A lifetime of wearing heavy plate helps with both. The corridors of Castle Black were chilly and sparsely lit by torches. Jaime felt each stone, each bit of gloom, weigh on him as he was led to a cramped cell of a chamber. A narrow bed, a small table, and a single candle were all that greeted him. The brother who escorted him spared no words, and Jaime did not bother to ask his name. He set his sword gently against the corner. In the flickering candlelight, the lion's head pommel glinted, an artifact of a life he no longer belonged to. That night, sleepless, he stared at the stone ceiling, remembering how he had once stood guard at the Red Keep's doors, how the city below had bustled with intrigue and luxury. Now, he heard only the distant howling of the wind beyond the wall, the subdued footfalls of the night guard patrolling the ramparts. The biting cold slipped in through the cracks in the walls, and even with a thin blanket draped over him, he shivered. He realized with a grim twist of his thoughts that this was how the rest of his life would be. An endless vigil, overshadowed by the monstrous presence of the wall, haunted by the ghosts of a vow he had broken and a vow he had grudgingly taken in its place. Morning brought no relief. The daily routine was rigorous. A meager breakfast of porridge, hours of training in the yard, menial chores, then a swift supper before nightfall. The recruits eyed Jaime warily at first. Some had heard rumors that a Lannister was among them, the very Kingslayer in their midst, but they dared not approach him. The more seasoned brothers, the ones who had served for years, took the existence of a disgraced knight in stride. The wall was a place for lost causes and second chances, though few found the latter. Ser Alistair Thorne, the master-at-arms, took a particular relish in making Jaime's life difficult. Perhaps he resented Jaime's skill with a sword, or perhaps he simply despised Lannisters. Every day, Thorne ordered Jaime to spar with multiple recruits at once, mocking him with jabs like, "If you can slay a king, surely you can handle 3 whelps." Jaime endured it, though more than once he had to rein in the urge to hurl an insult or break a nose. He soon discovered that any show of arrogance on his part would be answered with humiliation, either from Thorne or from the gruff veterans who wanted to see the lion turned into a docile pup. In spite of himself, Jaime found moments of grim satisfaction in training. He bested most opponents with ease, even in the biting cold that left the others stiff and slow. The sword was still an extension of his arm, the reflexes of a battle-honed knight guiding him. Some of the younger recruits stared in awe, albeit from a distance, and Jaime found his vanity stirred. Even here, on the edge of the world, he wanted to remind men that he was still the best. But his nights were the worst. He could not quiet his mind, haunted by the ghost of Aerys Targaryen's final scream and the stink of wildfire that had clung to the throne room. He remembered the spark of madness in Aerys's eyes, the moment the king had commanded him to bring Tywin Lannister's head and burn the city to cinders. Jaime had refused, and with that refusal, the entire history of the realm had changed. Yet no one hailed him as a hero. He was the Kingslayer, the Oathbreaker, a pariah. As the weeks turned into months, the snows began to fall more regularly. Jaime acclimated, in a way, to the new routine. The vow he had taken on the day of his arrival was seared into his mind. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. For him, there was no glory in it, no romantic notion of protecting the realms of men from unseen horrors. It was a penance, a life sentence. Yet some part of him found a twisted sense of relief in the forced discipline. The structure of the watch allowed him to avoid the swirl of regrets and what-ifs. Each chore, each drill, each long watch in the freezing night gave him just enough to keep his mind occupied. He noticed the varied backgrounds of the men around him. One was a former poacher from the Reach, who seldom spoke but had keen eyes for wildlife. Another was a petty thief from Flea Bottom, adept at picking locks. Still another was a high-born bastard from the Vale, whose refined speech contrasted sharply with his ragged attire. In these men, Jaime saw fragments of himself. Those who had been cast out, stripped of their past, forced to forge new identities. Perhaps he, too, was forging a new identity, though he could not yet imagine what it would be. The first time Jaime was assigned to ride out on a ranging beyond the wall, he felt a flicker of anticipation. The Rangers were the elite of the Night's Watch, responsible for patrolling the haunted forest, scouting for wildlings, and gathering intelligence. Mormont was hesitant to send Jaime so soon, but they needed every capable sword. Under the command of Ser Jeremy Ricker, a half-dozen men set out through the tunnel at the base of the wall, their breath misting in the frigid air. The haunted forest lived up to its name. Towering pines loomed overhead, their branches weighed down by snow. The silence was eerie, broken only by the crunch of hooves and the distant howl of wolves. Jaime's senses were on high alert, scanning every cluster of trees, every flicker of movement. Despite the heavy cloak of black wool, the cold seeped into his bones. He glanced around at his companions, hard-bitten men who had done this 100 times, and felt a surge of grudging respect for them. This was a far cry from the tours of duty he had known in the South, where knights jousted in tournaments under sunny skies. Here, every step could be your last. A wildling's arrow or a hidden pitfall might be waiting behind the next snowdrift. They made camp before dusk. A small fire crackled, providing meager warmth. Conversation was sparse. Jaime, not quite trusting these men, did not volunteer tales of his past. The men, for their part, asked little about him. Wordlessly, they all accepted that it was enough that he could handle a sword and ride a horse. Under the starry sky, Jaime found himself thinking about Cersei, about Tyrion, about the father he had let down. He wondered if they ever thought of him, or if they had buried him in memory as thoroughly as the rest of the realm had. On the second day of the ranging, they discovered a small wildling encampment, a scattering of lean-tos and extinguished fires. The wildlings who had been there were long gone, leaving scraps of food and footprints in the snow. Ser Jeremy ordered the men to spread out and search. Jaime moved silently through the remains, prodding at abandoned blankets and half-eaten rations. The footprints led deeper into the forest, but the light was fading, and pursuing them after dark would be foolish. That night, while standing watch, Jaime heard an unsettling sound in the distance. A harsh, guttural cry that did not seem like any animal he recognized. It raised the hairs on his neck. A glance at the others told him they, too, had heard it. But no one spoke of it. Instead, they huddled closer to the fire, gripping their weapons. The north was full of legends, giants, wights, others. Jaime had always dismissed such tales as fantasies. Now, in the hush of the haunted forest, he found no comfort in mocking them. They returned to Castle Black a few days later, weary and half-frozen, but unscathed. The routine resumed: training, chores, meager meals. Jaime found a grudging acceptance among some of the rangers. They recognized his competence, even if they despised his name. One of the older men, a grizzled ranger named Cutter, remarked one evening as they sharpened blades side by side, "Never thought I'd see a Lannister come to the wall. This place changes men for better or worse. I've seen murderers become heroes, and highborn knights become cowards." Jaime shrugged, not sure where he fit in that spectrum. Months passed into a year, then more. Jaime's hair grew longer, shaggier, and his face bore the rough stubble of a man who had long abandoned courtly grooming. Now and then, ravens arrived from the south, bearing messages from King's Landing or Winterfell. He learned that Robert was firmly seated on the throne, that peace had settled over most of the realm. He learned that his sister was queen, though no letter ever came for him personally. Tywin Lannister's name was mentioned in dispatches, always commanding respect and fear, but never referencing Jaime. It was as if he had ceased to exist to House Lannister. In the midst of this monotony, news filtered up that the Targaryen children had fled across the narrow sea, and Robert was sending assassins to root them out. Jaime felt no pang of guilt for the Mad King's heirs. After all, Aerys had tried to burn half the city. Still, a part of him wished that the realm would show some measure of mercy. He knew too well that madness ran in some Targaryens, but not all. Sometimes a child could be innocent of their parents' sins. His life settled into a grim pattern, though he excelled in the yard and on rangings. The younger recruits began to look up to him with something resembling admiration, for all that Jaime tried to discourage it. His skill was undeniable. Few among the watch could match him blow for blow, especially with a longsword. Ser Alliser Thorne's scorn never wavered, but the criticisms grew less pointed once Jaime proved he could endure the harshest tasks with minimal complaint. If nothing else, Jaime had always been stubborn. Then the day came when Lord Commander Mormont summoned Jaime to his solar again, a full year after his arrival. The old bear sat behind a rough-hewn table, maps and messages strewn before him. He looked up as Jaime entered, beckoning him to close the door. "I've a letter from King's Landing," Mormont began. "Apparently, there's to be a royal visit to Winterfell. King Robert and his queen, along with half the court. They plan to ride north. I expect they may pay a courtesy visit to the wall, though that remains uncertain." Jaime kept his face impassive, but a swirl of emotion churned in his gut. If the king and queen came north, that meant Cersei might be among them. It had been so long since he'd laid eyes on her. The thought of seeing her again, in all her regal splendor, here in this bleak fortress, made his pulse quicken. Mormont continued, "If they do come, they'll expect to see an orderly watch, prepared to demonstrate how we defend the realm. I'll not have them see bickering or insubordination. So I ask you plainly, can you control yourself, or will you let old grudges hamper the moment?" "I can control myself," Jaime answered swiftly. He wondered if Mormont expected him to try to kill the king or stage some sort of dramatic confrontation. The idea was laughable. Jaime's grudge was not with Robert personally, though the man had condemned him to the wall. His real bitterness was directed at the hypocrisy of a realm that needed him to commit regicide to save them, then branded him for it. Mormont tapped a finger on the table. I would have you lead a demonstration in the yard if they come. Show the Southerners we're not all convicts who forgot which end of a sword is sharp. Jaime hesitated, searching the old man's face. This was a measure of trust. As you command, Lord Commander. Days trickled by and ravens brought confirmation. The royal party would indeed visit the wall after their sojourn in Winterfell. The anticipation among the brothers was palpable. Some dreaded it, sure that the Southerners would sneer at their ragged clothing and poor conditions. Others hoped for fresh recruits or supplies once the king saw their hardships. Jaime himself fluctuated between a guarded excitement and a gnawing dread. What would it be like to see Cersei among the splendor of the court again? To see how she regarded him now that he was little more than a common foot soldier in black. When the day finally arrived, the courtyard bustled with frantic attempts at tidying up. The men shaped up in formation, wearing their least tattered cloaks. The king's retinue arrived amidst a swirl of horses, steel, and colorful banners. Robert Baratheon, larger than life, dismounted heavily, with Eddard Stark at his side, looking solemn as ever. Behind them came a procession of lords, ladies, knights, and squires. And there, in the midst of it all, Jaime saw Cersei, her golden hair gleaming under a fur-lined hood, her posture regal, her green eyes scanning the courtyard. She caught sight of Jaime, and for a heartbeat, their gazes locked. He saw no joy or relief on her face, only a flicker of... What was it? Disdain? Guilt? He could not tell. Formal greetings were exchanged with Mormont, and the king was swiftly ushered inside to warm himself. The rest of the court followed, except for a few who lingered in the courtyard, curious about the men of the Night's Watch. Jaime maintained his place in line, holding his helmet under one arm. Several times, he felt eyes upon him, whispers of, "Is that him?" drifting through the crowd. Yet he stood rigid, betraying no reaction. At length, the king emerged again, wearing a thick cloak, his face ruddy from the cold. "Let's see what you men are made of," he boomed, and the demonstration began. Ranger after ranger showed off archery, swordplay, endurance drills. Jaime watched from the sidelines at first, until Thorne barked his name. He stepped forward, drawing his sword in a fluid motion. There was a ripple in the crowd. Some recognized him, some recognized the sword, others simply saw a tall knight in black. Jaime faced off against 3 watchmen, each armed differently. One with a spear, one with a sword, and one with a mace. They circled him warily, and Jaime did not hesitate to take the offense. Steel rang against steel, the clang echoing off the cold stone walls. Jaime felt the old thrill of battle surge in his veins. He was no mere showman. He was a Lannister, raised to fight from childhood, tempered by real combat. Within moments, he had disarmed the spearman, knocked aside the mace, and forced the swordsman to yield. He glanced toward Robert and saw a flicker of grudging admiration in the king's eyes. The demonstration ended, and there was applause, half-hearted from some, genuine from others. Jaime did not bow. He simply turned and rejoined his brothers in black. He felt the burn of Cersei's stare from across the courtyard, but she had made no move to speak to him. Perhaps she was forbidden to, or perhaps she wished not to. That evening, a modest feast was held in the common hall, a courtesy to the royal guests. The men of the watch ate at separate tables, letting the lords and ladies dine in relative comfort at the head table with Mormont. Jaime was content to chew on a piece of boiled beef while listening to the hum of conversation. Now and then, his ears caught a stray remark. "That's him, the Kingslayer. Why didn't Robert just hang him? He fights well, I'll grant him that. A Lannister among crows. Strange times." He said nothing in his own defense. In the past, he might have retaliated with a sharp quip or a threat, but the wall had chipped away at his impulsive pride. Instead, he stared at his food, barely tasting it. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. Looking over his shoulder, he saw Queen Cersei. His heart lurched, but his face remained composed. She looked even more imposing up close, her features coldly beautiful, her manner guarded. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low enough that only he could hear. "It's been a long time, dear brother." Jaime set down his fork, standing to offer at least the semblance of courtesy. "Your Grace," he said, his voice almost mocking. He could not bring himself to lower his eyes, even here. He saw her lips tighten in annoyance. She wore a forced smile, as though for any observer's benefit. "I'm told you've been useful here, keeping the wildlings at bay." "I do what is required," Jaime said. He wondered if she had come to gloat or to comfort. Perhaps neither. Cersei's gaze flicked over his worn black cloak, the roughness of his unshaven face, the calluses on his hands. "You're changed," she murmured, barely audible over the din of the hall. "The years here have been an improvement?" Jaime interrupted, with a hint of his old sarcasm. "I'm sure you would think so. Does father still brood about me?" Cersei's eyes hardened. "He does not speak of you. You are dead to him." Jaime felt a surge of pain that he buried under a scornful twist of his lips. "What of you, sister? Am I dead to you as well?" She hesitated, her eyes flicking about to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "You are my brother," she said. "But you chose your path. You took that vow. You forsook your place by my side. Our side." He almost laughed at the absurdity. "You speak as if I had a choice. It was that or execution. Would you have me lose my head? Just for the sake of pride?" She shook her head, anger flashing. "I cannot linger here," she said quietly. "If the king notices my absence, he'll be suspicious." Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she added, "Take care, Jaime." Her fingers brushed his arm for the barest instant, and then she turned and swept away, leaving the scent of her perfume in the cold air behind her. He sank back onto the bench, staring at the half-eaten meat on his plate, a tumult of longing and bitterness swirling in his chest. So that was it. His father disowned him, his sister's affection cooled by politics and necessity. Even here, in this wretched corner of the realm, he was a prisoner to the illusions of family. He almost pitied himself, but he caught the bitter taste of self-pity and spat it out mentally. If he was to be a man of the Night's Watch, so be it. He would not weep for what was lost. The next morning, the royal party departed for Eastwatch by the Sea, or so the rumor went. They did not linger. Jaime resumed his duties as though nothing had happened. Yet a seed of disquiet lodged in him. The sight of Cersei, the knowledge of Tywin's rejection, the memory of Robert's condemnation, none of it sat well. He trained harder, pushed himself to the limits during rangings, often volunteered for the most dangerous tasks. At first, men thought he was seeking glory, but he knew it was something else. He was running from the ghosts of his old life. Time marched on. Under Lord Commander Mormont's leadership, the Watch stood firm despite dwindling resources. Wildling activity increased. There were rumors of a man calling himself the King Beyond the Wall, rallying the free folk. Jaime found himself confronting wildlings in skirmishes. They were desperate fighters, as tough as the land they inhabited. In the heat of those battles, Jaime felt alive in a way he had not since King's Landing, an edge of danger sharpening his reflexes. He was better than most of the Watch's men, but the wildlings were cunning, employing guerrilla tactics that tested even his skill. During one such clash, Jaime found himself separated from his fellow rangers, ambushed by a pair of wildling raiders near a frozen creek. The snow was up to his shins, limiting his movement, but he fought with the lethal grace that had once awed the Tourney grounds. He took a shallow cut on his arm but managed to strike down the first wildling. The second lunged with a spear, and Jaime sidestepped, burying his sword in the man's side. Steam rose from the blood as it hit the freezing air. Jaime withdrew his blade, panting, and glanced around to ensure there were no more attackers. The silence of the forest pressed in, broken only by his own ragged breathing. He was alone. He trudged through the snow, following footprints until he found his companions regrouping. One of them, a young recruit named Garrett, had an arrow in his shoulder. They made a makeshift bandage, then retreated south, battered but alive. Once safely back at Castle Black, Jaime reported to Mormont, who listened impassively, his face set in grim lines. A new wave of wildling raids was expected. There was talk of staging a larger expedition beyond the wall to discover what was truly happening among the free folk. Jaime offered to join, and Mormont accepted, perhaps trusting his skill or merely lacking better men. They departed at first light, a force of 50 black brothers, heavily provisioned for a long journey. The sun was little more than a pale disk in the eastern sky when they marched out, armed to the teeth. It felt like a proper military campaign, though their adversaries were scattered tribes of wildlings, not an organized army. Still, caution was paramount. The forest could swallow an unwary column in moments. As they moved beyond the wall, snow began to fall thickly, turning the world into a white blur. The nights were eerily silent. Jaime found himself riding with a group of rangers who had grown used to his presence. They shared stories around the campfire, tales of lost loves, stolen purses, murdered lords. Some men revealed they had been forcibly conscripted after petty crimes. Others were orphans with nowhere else to go. Jaime rarely spoke of his own past, but in bits and pieces, the truth had emerged. He was the Kingslayer, exiled here for regicide. Oddly, the men treated him no differently for it. At the wall, the man you were mattered more than the crime that sent you there. Weeks dragged on. They found empty villages, burned-out homesteads, signs of wildlings moving in larger numbers than ever before. Tension coiled through the rangers. The howling of wolves at night seemed closer, more threatening. Then, one frigid morning, they stumbled upon a grim discovery. A band of dead wildlings, slaughtered to the last man, their corpses arranged in a bizarre spiral pattern on the snowy ground. Jaime's blood ran cold. He had never seen anything like it. The watchers in black exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary raiding party. Some dark force was at play. That night, Lord Commander Mormont called a council around the fire. His face was cast in flickering shadows, his voice grim. "Whatever did this was not mere wildlings," he said. "I've heard tales of darker things that roam the far north. Some men whisper of white walkers, though we have not seen them for thousands of years. But something is out there, something that kills indiscriminately. We must learn more, but we must also be cautious. My duty is to keep you all alive if I can." A murmur rippled through the men. White walkers were the stuff of children's stories. Jaime felt an uncomfortable sense that the old man was not jesting. He remembered the haunting cry he had heard on that earlier ranging. The memory prickled his skin. He was no longer certain such myths were purely stories. In the weeks that followed, the expedition pressed on, heading ever deeper into the frozen wilderness. They encountered more signs of violence. Villages abandoned in haste, bloodstains on the snow, burnt shelters. The wildlife was sparse, the hush unsettling. At night, they posted double sentries, rotating in shifts. Jaime stood many of those watches, peering into the darkness, hand clenched around his sword hilt. His breath fogged in the frigid air, and each crack of ice or rustle of wind made his heart race. On one particularly cold night, with the moon high and the sky clear, he saw movement among the trees, a flicker of pale figures silent as ghosts. He strained his eyes, certain he was imagining it. But then a shape glided out from between the pines, tall and gaunt, eyes glowing with an otherworldly blue radiance. It stared at him across the clearing, and Jaime felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He slowly drew his sword, mouth going dry. The figure tilted its head, as though studying him. Then it vanished back into the shadows, leaving only a faint scratch in the snow that might have been footprints or might have been a trick of the moonlight. He considered rousing the camp but feared ridicule or panic. Instead, he kept silent until morning. Then he told Mormont what he had seen. The Lord Commander listened with furrowed brows. "We'll remain vigilant," he said simply. "We should send a raven to Castle Black. Let them know there may be others abroad." The raven was sent, but no immediate reply came. The expedition pressed further north, hoping to locate and negotiate with the wildling tribes that had not joined the supposed king beyond the wall. Days turned to nights, and each night seemed more foreboding. Gradually, the men grew tense, jumpy, convinced they were being watched. Jaime found himself on edge as well, though he tried to maintain his composure. He had faced mortal danger before, but this felt different, as though the land itself was hostile. One evening, as a heavy snowstorm forced them to make camp early, the wind began to howl like a chorus of banshees. Visibility was nearly zero. They huddled around fires, tents half buried in drifts. Some men prayed softly, others sharpened weapons. Jaime sat with his cloak pulled tight, feeling the ice in his bones, staring into the fire as if hoping to burn away his dread. Just then, a scream erupted from the far side of the camp. The men jumped to their feet, scrambling for weapons. Emerging into the white fury of the storm, Jaime saw vague silhouettes of black-clad figures running or stumbling. Another scream cut through the wind, then abruptly stopped. Through a swirl of snow, Jaime glimpsed something moving, a shape too large, too pale to be a man. He heard the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the sickening crunch of something giving way. He lunged forward, sword drawn, the snow stinging his face. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Men in black, locked in combat with tall, gaunt forms that glowed with a deathly radiance. A new wave of terror seized him. The others were no myth. One turned toward him, eyes bright blue, razor-thin lips pulled back in a grim smile. Jaime swung his sword, but the creature deflected it with a blade of ice that rang like crystal. The force of the impact sent a jolt up Jaime's arm, nearly numbing him. The other moved fluidly, mocking Jaime with its speed. He struck again, but the enemy's weapon turned his blade aside effortlessly. Mormont's voice roared from somewhere in the storm. "Fire! We need fire!" Men scrambled, brandishing torches and hurling them at these icy specters. The flames flickered in the wind, often extinguished or blown off course. Jaime ducked a slash that could have taken his head, then swung in a desperate arc, aiming for the creature's torso. His steel bit into something solid, but the other hissed, shards of ice fracturing from its form. For a heartbeat, Jaime thought he had prevailed. Then the wound seemed to knit itself, as though made of frost and darkness. The other's grin widened, and it lunged, driving Jaime back. A whoosh of flame erupted to Jaime's left. One of the Black brothers had set a ring of burning timber in a half-circle, driving the others back. Jaime seized the moment, retreating behind that circle of fire, panting. More shapes loomed, the rest of the others retreating, but not in fear, more like a tactical withdrawal. In seconds, they vanished into the swirling snow. The entire attack had lasted minutes, yet it felt like an eternity. Bodies of several watchmen lay scattered, their faces locked in expressions of horror. Among the wounded was Mormont himself, leaning on his sword. They regrouped hastily, fear etched into every face. Men spoke in hushed, trembling tones. "The others are real. We can't stay out here. We have to get back to the wall." Mormont, badly wounded, grimaced. "We're returning at first light," he said. "We can't face that again without obsidian or some damned help from the realm." Jaime swallowed hard, adrenaline still pumping. He had faced the legendary others and lived, but only barely. The next morning, with the storm eased, they moved as quickly as they could southward. Every shadow between the pines seemed to hold another threat. The wind moaned like a dying animal, and the sky was the color of dirty slate. Jaime never let his guard down, scanning the perimeter as they trudged through the snow. A handful of men had lost their nerve entirely, jumping at every twig snap. After a harrowing journey, they reached the wall again, battered and half-starved. Raven's Eye watchers on the battlements shouted in alarm, and the gates swung open to admit them. Inside, the men nearly collapsed with relief. Word spread fast among the garrison. The others had attacked. White Walkers were not just tales. A grim hush settled over Castle Black. If these nightmares from the Dawn Age were truly stirring, what hope did the poorly manned watch have? While Mormont was carried off to recover from his wounds, Jaime found himself summoned to a council of senior officers. They demanded every detail. Jaime recounted what he had seen. The impossible speed, the ice swords, the chilling blue eyes. He admitted that steel alone was nearly useless. Fire had driven them back, but they could not rely on that alone. A sense of dread pervaded the discussion. They had too few men, too few resources. The southern lords cared little for the threat in the north. It was a bleak reckoning. In the days that followed, they sent raven after raven south, pleading for men, for supplies, for any acknowledgement of the coming danger. Jaime doubted the realm would pay heed. They were more likely to dismiss it as the ravings of criminals in black. If the king did believe it, he might see it as a chance to unify the land, unless the threat seemed too distant to trouble the Iron Throne's comfort. Perhaps Eddard Stark would lend some aid. But how much? A restlessness gnawed at Jaime. The man he had become here at the Wall was not the same man who had once knelt for King Aerys' favor. If the others were real, then the Seven Kingdoms were in dire peril, and so were his siblings, his father, everyone he had once known. Despite his anger and bitterness, he did not wish for them to perish under a wave of icy death. Part of him wanted to ride south, to demand an audience with the king, to beg them to unite against this threat. But he was bound to the Night's Watch. Desertion meant death. And so he trained harder still, drilling his fellow brothers in combat, focusing on techniques that might protect them against the inhuman quickness of the others. He recommended that they gather dragonglass from wherever it could be found. Legends said that obsidian was anathema to the White Walkers. Some doubted him, but he insisted. In the old records hidden in the library, there were references to the Long Night, to the last hero who wielded dragonsteel or dragonglass. Many sneered, but desperation has a way of granting credence to old tales. With Mormont still bedridden, command fell to the officers, among whom Ser Alliser Thorne was prominent. Thorne was skeptical of Jaime's stories, suspecting an exaggeration, but he could not entirely dismiss the presence of dead men, or the battered rangers who had seen something beyond comprehension. The tension between Jaime and Thorne flared. Thorne resented the authority Jaime now wielded as an experienced ranger. Jaime bristled under the man's perpetual scorn. One frigid evening, after a grueling day of exercises, Thorne cornered Jaime in the armory. "You think you're some hero now?" Thorne spat, voice dripping with disdain. "Tricks with a sword, wild stories about the others. Don't think I haven't seen your ambition." Jaime met Thorne's glare. "I have no ambition, except to keep us alive. Maybe if you'd seen your brothers cut down by creatures you can barely fathom, you'd share that goal." Thorne sneered. "I've fought wildlings more times than you, Lannister, and I'm not fool enough to think we stand a chance if the others truly come. A handful of half-starved criminals in black can't fight an army of ice wraiths. Better to keep to our forts and hope the storm passes." "Then you're a coward," Jaime said, voice flat. "And if the others do come en masse, the storm won't just pass. It will sweep down through the north, and soon the entire realm will be at risk. If you're too blind or fearful to see that, we're already lost." Thorne's face twisted with anger. For a moment, Jaime thought the man might draw steel, but instead Thorne merely shook his head. "Kingslayer," he hissed, as though the word itself were a curse. Then he stormed out, leaving Jaime alone with the clang of distant hammers. The following day, ravens arrived with news. King Robert was busy with tournaments and feasts in King's Landing. The lords of the realm had no appetite to send men north based on rumors of supernatural beings. Some letters from smaller northern lords offered limited support, food shipments, a few volunteers, but nothing near enough. Jaime read the replies with mounting frustration. The realm he had once served refused to acknowledge the greatest threat it had ever faced. In a moment of dark humor, he considered the irony. Once, he had slain a king to protect the city from wildfire. Now, he was trying to warn the realm to protect it from an even more horrifying menace, and no one would listen. He was still the Oathbreaker, the man who killed his own king, so why trust him now? Time ground on. The men of the Watch made what preparations they could. Stacking firewood, crafting dragonglass daggers from old stores, fortifying their defenses. Jaime participated in the forging, a sword in one hand and a hammer in the other, forging arrowheads and small spear tips out of obsidian. The black glass was fragile, but if the tales were correct, it could be lethal to the others. That slim hope was all they had. Meanwhile, the wildlings grew bolder. Reports came of massing forces beyond the Frostfangs. Some said their so-called king beyond the wall sought to unite them all to flee south from the real threat in the lands of always winter. Men whispered that the others were driving the wildlings forward like cattle. The tension grew daily, until one morning, horns sounded from the watchtowers. Wildling raiders were approaching the wall in large numbers. Scrambling to man the ramparts, the Black brothers lined the battlements with bows and spears. Jaime stood among them, cloak whipping in the icy wind, scanning the treeline. Sure enough, wildling banners fluttered, and a ragged horde emerged from the forest. But they did not charge. Instead, a figure on horseback, bundled in fur, rode forward, waving a white scrap of cloth in the universal gesture of truce. The figure called up in a resonant voice, "We wish to speak with your commander." Jeor Mormont, still pale but upright with the aid of a cane, hobbled onto the battlements. Jaime stood at his side, curious. The rider announced, "I speak for the king beyond the wall. We seek passage through the wall, that we may flee the White Walkers. Let us pass, or we will take our chances by force. We have giants, mammoths, thousands of spears." A murmur ran through the watch. If the wildlings' numbers were as large as rumored, they might indeed overpower Castle Black. But letting them pass would be a flagrant violation of centuries-old vows to defend the realm from exactly such invasions. Yet, if the wildlings were truly fleeing the others, perhaps they posed less threat than the legends suggested. Mormont's expression was stony. He gestured for the gate to open slightly, admitting the emissary alone. In the courtyard, they held a tense parley. The emissary, a tall woman with braided hair, explained that Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, was once a Black brother himself. He believed the real war was not between wildlings and kneelers, but between the living and the dead. The woman described horrifying attacks by the others in the far north, entire camps wiped out overnight. They would rather break the wall and risk southern vengeance than face extinction by these ice demons. Jaime listened, heart pounding. This was the chance to unify, to bring a warning so dire that even the lords in the south would have to heed it. Mormont looked uncertain. Thorn scoffed. Some of the officers demanded they fight to the last man rather than break tradition. Jaime spoke up. "We should consider letting them pass under terms. We need every living sword. The real threat is out there, beyond the wall." Thorn shot him a hateful glare. "Treason, is it? To suggest letting wildlings invade the realm?" Jaime bit back an angry retort. "It's not treason if we do it to save the realm from a worse fate. If half the rumors are true, the others are coming for all of us. The wildlings are men, like us. They breathe, they bleed. The others do not." The debate raged for hours. Eventually, Mormont made a difficult decision. He would ride out to meet Mance Rayder himself and hear his terms, accompanied by a small party. Jaime volunteered. Thorn opposed it, insisting Jaime could not be trusted, but Mormont overruled him. They would see if an alliance or a truce was possible. If not, a massive battle might erupt at the wall, a battle that could leave the Night's Watch crippled. For the first time in Jaime's memory, the huge outer gates were unbarred for a peace talk with a wildling host. Mormont, Jaime, and a handful of rangers rode out, the wind biting at their exposed skin. Across the field of snow, the wildling army waited hundreds, if not thousands, of fur-clad figures, standing near mammoths and giant kin. The sheer size made Jaime's stomach clench. If this came to bloodshed, the watch would be overrun. They dismounted at the edge of the wildling lines, where a lone figure in patched black and brown cloaks stood by a great fire. "Mance Rayder," said Mormont, voice echoing in the hush. Jaime eyed the self-styled king beyond the wall, a lean, sharp-eyed man with a bearing that spoke of command. Former Black brother indeed. Mance inclined his head. "Old bear," he said with a half-smile. "Long time. Mormont wasted no time on pleasantries. "We hear you're running from the White Walkers. We've seen them as well. But I cannot simply open the gates for you." Mance's eyes flicked to Jaime, interest piqued. "You have highborn knights in your ranks now? Or is that the Kingslayer?" He chuckled softly. "Strange times indeed." Jaime said nothing. He let Mormont do the talking. A tense negotiation followed, Mance insisting his people be allowed safe passage south in exchange for peace. Mormont demanded hostages, a vow they would not pillage the north. Mance promised it was not conquest they sought, but survival. Through it all, Jaime remained quiet, though his thoughts churned. If the White Walkers truly marched south, any man who could wield a sword was an ally, wildling or not. Some deep corner of Jaime felt an odd sense of purpose in this. He had once sworn to protect the king. Now he was determined to protect the entire realm from a threat that made kings pale in comparison. Eventually, Mormont and Mance reached a tentative agreement. The wildlings would camp near the wall under watchful eyes, while word was sent south to Winterfell for negotiations. If the realm refused them entry, the wildlings would have no choice but to force their way through. It was an uneasy truce, but better than outright slaughter. As they parted ways, Mance's gaze fell on Jaime once more. "We all have stories, Kingslayer," he said in a low voice. "But this war will make them all meaningless if we don't stand together." Jaime nodded grimly. "We'll see how the realm responds. If they're fools, we'll all die." With that, they rode back to Castle Black, aware that they had just become a pivot point in history. Jaime wondered if the proud lords of the Seven Kingdoms would accept wildlings into their lands or if they would scorn them as savages. He feared the latter. The watchmen scrambled to send ravens in all directions, bearing the urgent plea. "The king beyond the wall stands at the gates, seeking refuge from the White Walkers. Will the realm unite, or let the others devour them all?" Days passed, then weeks. More wildlings arrived, swelling the host outside the wall. Skirmishes broke out between restless clansmen and black brothers. Though Mance tried to keep them in line, tensions soared. Food grew scarce. Winter was tightening its grip. Meanwhile, no decisive word came from the south. The lords squabbled, debating the threat's authenticity. Some claimed the Night's Watch had been duped by a cunning wildling trick. Jaime found himself patrolling the makeshift boundary day after day, at times exchanging curt words with wildling lookouts. He noticed some of them had families, children huddled in furs, wide-eyed with hunger and fear. In those moments, he felt a pang of compassion, startling in its intensity. He recalled the small folk in King's Landing during the war, cowering from the wrath of kings. Here, these people had fled an unimaginable horror, only to be met with suspicion and the threat of steel. The tension built toward a breaking point. If winter storms ravaged the camps, the wildlings might assault the wall out of desperation. The Black Brothers were on constant alert. Jaime tried to reason with his fellow officers. Better to help them than to force a battle that might weaken them all before the real war. Some listened. Others, like Thorne, refused. Lord Commander Mormont vacillated, torn between centuries of tradition and the pressing reality. Meanwhile, news from beyond the wall grew ever grimmer. The others were on the move, leaving villages of the free folk frozen in unnatural ice, reanimating corpses to swell their ranks. Each new rumor struck fear into the watch. Late one night, as Jaime walked the battlements, he paused to look out over the vast white plains. The wildling fires dotted the distance, small flickers of warmth in a dying land. The sky was streaked with pale moonlight. The wind moaned like a lament. Standing there, Jaime felt a strange calm. Perhaps the gods, if they existed, had placed him here for a reason, stripped him of his white cloak and forced him into black so he might fight a greater battle. He had once saved King's Landing by killing his king, a deed that haunted him. Now he stood ready to save the realm from the oldest of nightmares. It seemed an odd symmetry. He wondered if anyone would call him a hero this time, or if the realm would once again curse him for doing what was necessary. Drawing his cloak tighter, Jaime turned and continued his patrol. The night was cold, but he felt a fierce resolve burning in his chest. He was no longer Jaime Lannister, the Kingsguard prodigy, the golden son of House Lannister. He was the Kingslayer, a brother of the Night's Watch, standing guard over a precarious peace, determined to protect the realm. Even if it never thanked him, even if he died in the attempt. That was his new oath, and this time he would not break it.